Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you all again for Post-Secondary Pathways. Just going to wait about another minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, as folks continue to log on here, we will go ahead and get started. So my name is Madeline Smith. I am the Managing Director at the Hunt Institute, and we are a national nonprofit founded by four-term North Carolina Governor, Jim Hunt. We work across the continuum to convene and inform policymakers and, of course, on education policy issues from prenatal to post-secondary. So I'm very excited to welcome you all to today's session, during which we will discuss the role of affirmative action in higher education and explore how recent Supreme Court decisions will affect university admissions policies and how institutions can continue to diversify college campuses across the nation. So as you log on, if you wouldn't mind, please dropping your name, title, and organization in the chat to let us know where you're joining from. It would be greatly appreciated. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Art Coleman, who is the managing partner at Education Council. That is a mission-based education consulting firm headquartered in Washington, D.C., and Art will be our moderator for the day. So with that, Art, I turn the floor to you.
Thanks, Madeline, so much. And thanks to all of you who've joined us. I've got a few housekeeping notes before we dive in. Our team has turned on closed captioning, and it should be live on your screen. If you have any difficulties with that, please let a member of the Hunt Institute know in the chat. Also, today's session is going to be recorded and publicized after the webinar. After the session, the Hunt Institute will send the recording along with key takeaways to all attendees today. And finally, we'll have time for Q&A at the end of today's session. Please submit as we go through the conversation in the first phases of the discussion. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature, and we'll try to elevate as many of your questions and get to them before we wrap up around 3 o'clock Eastern time today. I'm honored to be joined by incredible panelists here for this program, and I'm going to introduce them in a minute and give them a chance to give some broad perspective before we dive into more specific questions. But before I do, I've been tasked with just grounding the conversation in the reality of the Supreme Court's recent Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and UNC decision, which came out just a little over 4 months ago. In a nutshell, the Supreme Court ruled that the race-conscious practices advanced by Harvard and UNC were unlawful, in effect undercutting about 45 years of precedent where courts had recognized certain compelling interests in the educational benefits of diversity, which the court found no longer to be sufficiently concrete or precise to justify those race status-conscious practices. At the same time, the court, for practical purposes, presently eliminated the consideration of an applicant's race or ethnicity status in admissions. That is, the fact that a student might be a student of color couldn't be considered. The court at the same time said that, of course, institutions could consider an applicant's lived experience or perspective associated with their racial identity as part of the admissions decision-making. And so I think mindful of a lot of the rhetoric that is suggested broadly that somehow the court has wiped out any and all consideration of race in admissions. The language from the Chief Justice's opinion actually navigates a very fine line between prohibited consideration of status, but permissible consideration of an applicant's lived experience or perspective tied to their particular racial identity. And so with that as a foundation, let me start to begin the conversation by introducing CJ Powell. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on CJ. He currently serves as Director of Advocacy at the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. In this role, he leads the advocacy efforts for the association's more than 26,000 person membership on the state and federal level on issues related to college access. Most recently, he served in the Biden-Harris administration as an appointee at the Department of Education as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education before his promotion to Chief of Staff in the same office. He began his career as a college advisor in the College Advising Corps, assisting students in rural North Carolina in planning their post-secondary lives. CJ, it's great to see you. We're spending a lot of time together these days. And so I'd love for you to just begin as we kick off the conversation. Tell our audience about the work you do at NACAC and how you're grounding your focus on student access and opportunity on issues of equity-centered college admissions practices.
Thanks, Art, for that introduction. And yes, you're right. We are spending a lot of time together, which is one of the ways that we're making sure that our work is informed by equity-centered college admissions practices. But broadly, I think it's really important to note that we're working on both sides of the desk to make sure that the field is informed as well as parents and families. And so on the high school counselor side of the desk, we have released guidance and tools that we came together with Education Council to create to assist school counselors in having conversations with students and families about what is allowed in the college application process now and what has changed. And that's a really helpful tool that we used, that we create in concert with school counselors to make sure that it was actually helpful to their practices as they have entered into this school year. On the other side of the desk, working with colleges and universities, we have been working with admissions teams and making sure that we're getting out as much information as we can to ensure that they are creating programs and creating procedures to ensure that they, while are unable to use racial status indicators in the college application process, are thinking holistically about how they can guarantee that they have a more diverse applicant pool so that that will yield more diverse student bodies. Additionally, we have been talking to our members and telling them, hey, think about ways that your institution can really ensure that they're meeting the needs of all of their students from the top down and all of the policies so that students feel more welcomed on campus and feel like when they arrive, that this is a place where they can be successful and be welcomed. It is not just about the getting in piece anymore. It is really about the sense of belonging and the completion piece, because while it's important to get in, if you're not getting through, that's unhelpful. And so we've been really encouraging our members to think about ways to message on those completion and success initiatives that they have going on, while also building really robust programming around how they can diversify their pipeline into the schools.
Thanks, CJ. And let me also introduce Secretary Brian Bridges, who is going to give us some brief opening remarks as well. A brief background on him. Dr. Bridges currently serves as Secretary of Higher Education for the state of New Jersey and is responsible for policy development and coordination of higher education activities for the state. He previously served as Vice President of Research and Member Engagement at the United Negro College Fund, where he led UNCF's Frederick Patterson Research Institute and the Institute for Capacity Building. He served as a principal research officer, editor, and contributor to publications, as well as a manager of internal and external projects involving capacity building, evaluation, and assessment. Secretary Bridges, thank you so much for joining us. Can you talk to us briefly as we kick off about your work in New Jersey and how you're advancing the equity and access agenda?
Well, thank you, Art. I appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you and CJ as well. And so to give you just a little bit of a background around the work that we're doing here in New Jersey, my vision as Secretary is to truly accelerate upward mobility for all New Jerseyans, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, through equitable pathways to post-secondary and career success. And so the way we do that is by leveraging our state plan for higher education, which was created under my predecessor, Zakiya Smith-Ellis, who many of us know well, which prioritizes students' access to safe and inclusive learning environments and an affordable college education. We actually, out of that state plan, we have a group called the Campus Sexual Assault Commission, which has evolved in ways to not just address campus sexual assault, but also has tried to focus a little more broadly in addressing issues related to safe and inclusive learning environments, which is one of the 5 pillars of the state plan. So I really want to share kind of 3 initiatives, 3 kind of big, broad initiatives that build on the state plan that we've implemented under Governor Murphy's aggressive higher education agenda. And his agenda focuses on equity in all of our efforts, and not just creating more equity, but also addressing inequities of the past. These 3 large, broad initiatives can help show how New Jersey has taken efforts to improve college access, affordability, and attainment. And the first one is really through the implementation of our College Promise programs. Our Community College Opportunity Grant, which provides free tuition to students under a certain threshold and reduced tuition for students above 65K, from 65 to 100K income. And our Garden State, that's for community college students, and our Garden State Guarantee, which provides 2 years of free tuition at a 4-year state institution that mirrors the Community College Opportunity Grant. So both programs for families, students from families under 65K, they get tuition and fees free. And then for students between 65 to 100K, they're able to get a reduced tuition cost at community colleges, 2 years at community colleges and 2 years at a 4-year institution. And so together, these programs form a pathway for students to pursue a 2 or 4-year degree, tuition free, which creates opportunity for New Jersey residents that they didn't have before. Our goal is truly, through this effort and others, to reduce what is arguably the primary obstacle to access, which is affordability. And so it's a kind of these programs together are kind of a cornerstone example of New Jersey's investment in our workers and the future of the economy by building equitable pathways that are not reliant on funding to post-secondary education and career success. So that's the first initiative. The second one is really about access, particularly for those who started college and stopped out. Our Some College No Degree initiative, which is a statewide approach to re-engage more than 750,000 New Jersey residents who have started college but never completed their degree or credential. And that's incredibly critical as we look to fill talent gaps, particularly from an equitable standpoint, to ensure that all New Jerseyans, regardless of life circumstances, have the tools and skills for those jobs to fuel our future workforce. And so we've been working with our institutions and our third-party vendor to ensure that this population will have the supports and resources to successfully re-enroll, persist, and complete. And then the third initiative is our outcomes-based allocation, which is really focused on affordability and access. And we utilize an outcomes-based allocation funding formula, which was created by my predecessor as well. And we've revised and fine-tuned the formula further once I arrived for us to how we distribute a proportion of our operating aid to public 4-year institutions. Now, the OBA rewards institutions for post-secondary outcomes that align with state priorities, particularly around equity. So for instance, the focus of the OBA is on degree completions and access for low-income students through 2 primary metrics. And that's the total number of degrees and certificates awarded, and the number of enrolled students with adjusted gross incomes below 65,000, which aligns it with our Promise program. And so initially we had used a metric of Pell recipients, but we've expanded that to be broader using the adjusted gross income below 65,000. So we can create a more inclusive definition of low income, serving more students. And so the OBA also places heavy weights on underrepresented ethnic and racial minority student enrollment and completions, thereby incentivizing institutions to not only help expand access, but also to help those students persist through to completion. So that's just a little bit about what we've got going on here in New Jersey. And, it's all driven toward helping to remove barriers and obstacles to help students get to and through college.
Thanks so much, Mr. Secretary. CJ, let me turn back to you for a second. We're all sort of living the sort of after effects of what was a legal earthquake with the Supreme Court's decision in the SFFA cases. And I think while it wasn't an unexpected outcome from this court, you are now dealing with stakeholders, thousands and thousands around the country, who are both tired and apprehensive about navigating the fine lines of the Supreme Court's decision, who remain passionately committed to the DEI kinds of goals that you talked about earlier. How is NACAC thinking about and what kind of guidance are you offering to college counselors in terms of the steps they can take or the strategies they should consider as we're all sort of navigating this new terrain on this legal landscape?
Sure. I think when we think about our school counselors, one of the biggest things that we have wanted to make sure that they know is that the burden really is on the colleges and universities to make sure that that data regarding racial and ethnicity status paired with an application remains separate for those who are reading the applications and making the decisions, so that students don't feel panicked about having to change their application or understanding what information the readers are going to be able to get. So we've been really working with them to make sure that they know that they just need to let their students understand that the game for them isn't actually much different. They just need to share their whole story and bring their whole self to the application the same way they would normally, and don't feel the need to play up anything that they don't feel comfortable playing up about their background or trying to force an issue that doesn't fit in their application. I think we've also worked and had conversations on the college and university side about how they can think differently about their recruitment strategies. So one of the issues that I remember coming up during my time as an advisor was just getting out there and visiting the schools that have large concentrations of students that you want. Being in rural North Carolina, it was challenging to get some of these institutions that may have used race conscious admissions out to visit the schools that I was working in, because it wasn't as much bang for their buck. But my students knew of these schools. They had heard of UNC as North Carolina residents, but there was a sense of belonging problem. Making sure that those connections with those communities are genuine was something that we've been talking about a lot. And we've also had conversations with institutions and with you, Art, about what policies and admissions are overly restrictive and disproportionately impact students of color. And so thinking about ways to tweak that. So for instance, does a student need to apply to a specific college, say for instance, a college of engineering on a college campus, or can they just apply to the school and then go to the College of Engineering? So having institutions think about some of these policies that have erected barriers for communities of color gaining access to their schools is something that we've been really encouraging institutions to think about as we have been navigating this post-SFFA world, and which has made us really have to do a deep dive into the institutional policies that are on campuses that can create barriers to students of color.
Thanks, CJ. Secretary Bridges, let me just pivot to you in your particular role as a state official. I think in our context and sort of the typical conversation we see at play, it's usually the feds are telling institutions what to do or not to do, sort of in this legally charged environment. But state leaders like you have a particular role to sort of help institutions and support institutions in both navigating this space, but you're also dealing with not only a court of law that's rendered decisions that have consequential impact on your member institutions. We're also dealing with the intersectionality here of the court of public opinion, where there's a lot of political work at play, and we see a lot of anti-DEI movement on this front in a number of states. I'm just curious for you to reflect for us how you see your role and what you think it's really important for state leaders at this very tenuous but important moment in time to be doing as we think about the future.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question, Art. I thought I was still on mute. I think it's important for state leaders to exhibit leadership at this time, especially because I've found that despite what sometimes comes down from the federal government, you don't get the same level of intensity at the state level. And sometimes you often in many states, and not just our stereotypical blue states and red states, but oftentimes I think that there are more opportunities for collaboration across divides, what seem like at the federal level divides. And so it's important to remain responsive to constituents and stakeholders. I've told people often that you have to make sure that the local electorate is hearing the voices and concerns of those on the ground. And one of the ways that that often happens in the most effective way is to make sure that stakeholder groups, particularly some of these lobbying agencies, some of the nonprofits, some of the local advocacy groups are making their voices heard and remind the elected officials of their concerns and how they can bring those concerns to bear on election day. I think that's one of the most important things that elected officials need to be mindful of. So as a state official like myself, I have to make sure that I'm being responsive and in communication with constituents and stakeholders from different backgrounds so that we can communicate the state's position, but that we can also hear from the grassroots how people are feeling about these things and convey to them that they need to make the legislature aware of those concerns. We also need data to inform our various approaches so that the policies and the folks on the ground can appropriately respond. I think sometimes, when you have places, we've got a robust advocacy group or robust set of advocacy groups in places like Newark, for instance. Those people and those advocacy groups, I don't know that they sometimes understand the power of their voices, but some of them do. And when they can come together collectively to demonstrate that to the powers that be, I think having data to reinforce their position, data which is sometimes provided by our office and other state agencies, helps to just reinforce the message even more clearly. I think also state officials, and we have to be careful about this one, but we can also leverage the bully pulpit and work collaboratively and creatively with legislators and stakeholders to help convey why certain policies benefit or negatively impact our state in different ways, whether it's the impact on the economy, whether it's the impact on colleges and universities and the students who attend them, whether it's the impact on the workforce. And I think one of the messages that resonates the most, especially in this day and age where the economy is so important in driving pretty much everything that we do, we have to help people understand that impacts like the decision by the High Court around affirmative action back in the summer will have long-term, short-term implications, of course, but will have long-term implications on the workforce and the economy and the state's ability to meet its future demands and future needs. So I think that it has to be a complex message that is cultivated and nurtured by external entities, but that is also informed by the work taking place by state officials like myself.
Great. So CJ, let me pick up on a theme from the secretary and come back to you. He talked about the prospect and the imperative, frankly, of innovation at this moment in time. And I know NACAC has been instrumental in sort of leading the field and trying to elevate ideas that may be new in some ways and innovative as we think through not just the technical, how do you comply with this court opinion, but how do we think differently about equity and access moving forward? Could you share with us some perspectives that you've got from the important work that NACAC has been leading on that front?
Sure. I think one of the biggest lessons that we have gleaned is that colleges and universities are really going to have to step up and fill the gap with some of that innovation that was much more easily done before this case, because there wasn't going to be the political pressure of overextending what this decision means. And so that is to say, thinking about ways that your recruitment programs can be used to really provide robust pipelines to your institution, thinking about ways that your college and universities admissions requirements are used in a way that they are necessary for the institution, but aren't overly burdensome to students who just so happen to not be born in a place that offered things like a calculus course, right? Thinking about those availability of courses that have no, the student cannot demonstrate any proficiency in that course because they don't have it offered. And so making sure that there isn't an unfair or a disadvantage to those students is one of those other pieces that we have been really picking up on and seeing gain a lot of steam. I also think the use of testing will continue to change, and that's something that we've done a lot of work on. We had a test optional research collaborative where we were seeing that institutions were running towards test optional, but maybe not necessarily communicating it well enough for students to understand that they were doing that so that a student can feel confident about the feat that they were placing forward in the application process, because there's differences between test blind, test optional, and what does it mean if an institution still requires a test for merit-based aid. And so really encouraging institutions to think through some of these processes to make sure that they're actually aligned with the articulated goal of diversity, but don't unnecessarily create new burdens and new barriers to students that they're trying to help.
Great.
All right, can I respond to something that CJ just said?
Absolutely.
That I think reminded me of something around the idea of making sure that you do no harm. And, you know, one of the things that we've done in New Jersey is Governor Murphy appointed a wealth disparity task force. And part of that task force, part of the charge was to evaluate policies that we have across the state to make sure that current policies aren't doing any harm to students inadvertently. You know, there are times that there are unintended consequences that emerge from certain policies that have kind of a deleterious effect from time to time. And you look back and realize that, you know, that policy that was implemented 20 or 30 years ago might have had some good intentions at the time. But since then, there have been unintended consequences that have resulted in a chilling effect of some sort on students' ability to succeed. And so one of the things that we've been doing in New Jersey as well is through our Wealth Disparity Task Force is to look at those kinds of policies, whether it's education, whether it's housing policies or the like, that have had those kinds of effects. So CJ just said something that reminded me about that. And we have to make sure that as state leaders, we also have to look at policies to make sure that we don't have policies with unintended consequences, unintended negative consequences.
Such a powerful point in terms of stepping back from the details of any one particular policy and look at your entire suite of policies and practices on this front, which I think is important from a state standpoint as well as an institutional standpoint. Let me just ask you, in your experience playing off of that perspective, given the work you've done on the ground, do you have a sense of what you think you're hearing, whether it's from students directly or institutional stakeholders, as what remain the biggest barriers that we've got to sort of tackle in the context of ensuring we've got full access and opportunity for all students, regardless of background?
You know, I think in talking with the leaders of our institutions in New Jersey, you know, we do our best to try to remove barriers to access. New Jersey is a high income state with arguably some of the best schools in the country, but that doesn't tell the entire picture. And I think that the leadership in the state has been focused on that and trying to make sure, how do we remove some of those remaining barriers? We've removed a lot. We've removed a lot of the financial barriers and a lot of the financial obstacles. And what we're trying to focus on now is targeting those school districts that aren't as well served, and often are tied up into economic limitations on those communities, and limited economic opportunities in those communities. And how do we help remove barriers for those students? How do we create more on-ramps and exposure for those students to the possibilities of what a career option might be in New Jersey for them? How do we work with the school districts to create and facilitate more options for those students, like dual enrollment, for instance? How do we get students more excited about the opportunities available to them as early as middle school? Because as we know from the research, that in some of our lowest income communities across the country, that students by middle school, they've already given up hope. Many of them have already given up hope of the opportunities that might be available to them. And so our focus has been on working collaboratively. We have a dual enrollment pilot that we're implementing now in the state, focused on with the equity opportunity, focused on the lowest income. We're focusing our pilot on school districts where with reduced or free lunch, because dual enrollment is actually already happening in the state. The unfortunate issue is that the people who are taking advantage of dual enrollment are the ones who can afford to take advantage of it. And unfortunately, not enough of our low-income students are taking advantage of dual enrollment opportunities. So we're trying to do things, looking at those policies, trying to implement policies and practices that remove the remaining barriers. And hopefully we can continue to collaborate together with our legislative partners as well to continue to do so. But it's a long slog. It's something that requires persistence. That if you give up, if you let your feet off the gas for 4 years or 8 years, you can find yourself taking steps backward rather than forward. So we're trying to remain diligent on that front.
So let me pivot, and I'm going to stick with you for a second, Mr. Secretary. Let me pivot from the sort of more lens of challenge to one of opportunity in the future. We're at a sort of interesting crossroads right now nationally. Issues of race, ethnicity, in light of educational opportunity, are front and center at almost every turn. And we've taken some body blows, if you will, from the federal courts, among others, on this front. What at this moment in time gives you hope? What gives you a foundation for waking up every day with energy and optimism, continuing the important work you're doing?
You know what gives me hope, Art, is that we live in a different time where the voices for justice are louder and stronger than ever before, and there are platforms to amplify those voices even further. And so I think that we have social media and other platforms out there that allow people to amplify the injustices that continue to take place. We know that they will continue to take place. And what gives me hope is that there's a renewed sense of purpose from a younger generation of individuals who are as fervent about the work as ever before, and that are willing to hold elected officials and those in power accountable in ways that 40 or 50 years ago, there were groups doing that, but it's much more powerful in a way that we've not seen before. So that's what really gives me hope. What also gives me hope is that, I can say this in New Jersey, in a state that has a supermajority that was actually just further strengthened on this past Tuesday, where there was worry that some of the legislature might turn red, and there was some worries about losing one chamber of the House of the Assembly, but actually that was strengthened. So the fact that we have a Democratic governor who believes in these progressive ideals and a completely Democratic legislature gives me hope that we can continue to advance some of these gains for equity that we've been able to advance over the last 6 years under Governor Murphy. And that gives me hope for us to be able to continue to advance the work that we've been doing thus far.
And so, CJ, I'm going to come to you in a minute with that very same question in terms of what gives you hope. But before I do, let me just remind our attendees, If you've got questions for these policy leaders in this space, let me encourage you to post those questions in the Q&A function so that we can elevate those as we prepare to sort of pivot to that segment of Q&A. So CJ, let me ask you the same question. Given all of the challenges of the day and all the work that lies ahead, what gives you hope and a sense of optimism about continuing to advance the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the benefit of all students?
I think kind of going off of something that Secretary Bridges said, it is the fact that many people who are most close to this work and people who aren't as in touch with education or educational opportunities were upset and or confused and or frustrated with this decision. I think that there was a time in this country where had this decision come down, way more people would have been high-fiving and saying, thank goodness that's over. And right now, what we have seen is that's quite the opposite. People recognize that this was a knockdown a little bit, but they have gotten back up and they dusted themselves off from institutional leaders who, some of whom have been in some tough states, to come out and make some really strong statements, to students for whom education and diversity of campus is incredibly important. We recently had a poll of young people, of which more than 3/4 said that having a diverse campus was really important to them. And that is something that I think is really important and we can't lose track of. And then on the outside, we also had school counselors be really frustrated with this idea and with this decision. So I think the fact that there was even this much pushback and uproar over this decision is one of the things that gives me hope. Something else that gives me hope is that this is creating really exciting opportunities for collaboration with partners that had not always been talking to one another. So whether that be understanding and getting the perspective of civil rights organizations to make sure that they're doing things to meet those needs of all diverse communities on campus, whether that be thinking creatively through institutional partnerships and being recommitted perhaps to taking stronger steps towards fixing transfer pipelines in places where that's weaker. I think there's been really exciting ideas and implementation of ideas that have come out of this decision as a result that make me really excited to see how many more tools we have at our disposal in our toolbox that we than just race conscious admissions in the way that we had it, that have been chiseled away at over time.
Thanks, CJ. And I appreciate you lifting up the information about the survey and about the perspective of students about the importance of diversity. I should have elevated at the outset, and I will just elevate it here from a legal standpoint, looking for those few but important kernels of what's possible or doable in the context of the court's otherwise adverse ruling. One of the notable points by the Chief Justice was an express recognition that institutions of higher education get to define their missions as they see fit. And so that still says you may go forth with your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. In fact, this very conservative majority recognized Harvard's and UNC's goals tied to diversity as commendable goals, just insufficiently concrete to justify that race status consideration at the outset. So we should recognize that's an important foundational point as we think through the work ahead moving forward. Secretary Bridges, I've got a question. I will start with you, and CJ, you may have perspectives on this too. How can state officials meaningfully collaborate with advocacy organizations and higher education institutions? What's your sort of experience in terms of navigating this space as a state official?
Sure, thank you. And I want to follow up on something that CJ was just said in his last remarks about, you know, the time that we're in, and I kind of alluded to it, that, you know, if this decision was made, say, 50 years ago in the early 70s, a lot of people would have said, oh, well, you know, okay, all right, you know, it's the times, it's the 70s. I'm not surprised that this happened. And I don't think you would have seen the same kind of response that we see today. And I think that's one of the things that is so hopeful for us for our future. I think that so I'll be fully honest with everyone here on the call that as a state official, we do have to be careful about how much we invite collaboration with. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You want to work with our stakeholders across the state, but at the same time, you have to be mindful that at some point that bill will come due, and those entities will expect something of the state officials, and that might not always align with their agenda. And so we have to be careful about that and set expectations up front. So one of the things that we've done is, I've had an open door policy. Whenever we get outreach from advocacy organizations or grassroots organizations, community organizations, we always take the call, we always respond, and we'll work with them within the boundaries of their position and the administration's position, because of course we can't go against the administration. We have to often help educate people how this kind of thing works, and hopefully can work together with them to try to come to a mutual understanding that might not be 100% of what they want, but is kind of a compromise between their goals and that of the administration. So I think that I'm often out and about attending events and meeting people, making yourself seen, being transparent and open with constituents about your availability is one way of doing so. State officials are paid by the taxpayers, and people need to remind themselves that if you want to reach out to them, you should be available to reach out to the secretary or commissioner of higher education in your state and get a meeting with them to let them know about your concerns. And if you can't do that, you have the availability to go to your legislator or even request a meeting of the governor. So, I hope people feel empowered to be able to do those things, even if they don't necessarily understand how to do them. You should be able to, in this day and age, go to your website and get that information and be able to make those requests.
Thanks. And so CJ, let me ask a version of that question to you. NACAC is an organization, you are the largest organizations around with thousands and thousands of members. So your stakeholder group is immensely large and varied. And in that context, I think we often think, and this is one of your sort of unique strengths as an organization, you not only reflect and represent the K through 12 community through high school counselors, you've got the higher education community through college admissions officials as well. So you've got a sort of dual lens, but there's actually a sort of third group that's really critical to so much of the work on the ground, and it's community-based organizations. I wonder if you would just sort of reflect for us how you think about the role of an organization like NACAC, the importance of engagement, and maybe elevating the particular role that in this moment in time CBOs might play in this space.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm excited to talk about this. So apologies if this is a bit of a soapbox. But I know that spending time in the federal government, one of the things that was most helpful from the CBOs and advocacy organizations was the sending of reports. And I will say that as NACAC, we will send a lot of information to officials so that they understand if they're looking for an answer on a certain topic, anything related to admissions, we are the folks to turn to. And I think highlighting the work of our CBOs, perhaps in district or in states, is another way that we can do a really great job of that. So encouraging our CBO members to go to the state assemblies or the state legislatures and telling their stories about the work that they're doing and why they're doing it is something that is incredibly important, because those stories, along with the strong data and reports, are what the policymakers will tend to remember. They tend to remember what's happening in their district, in their state, with those communities that will be in front of them. So making sure that our CPOs are available and ready to tell their stories and their why, I think goes a long way in building that relationship and building that trust, so that when state officials are looking to use their bully pulpit on really important issues, they already have places where they can spotlight the right thing and encourage the right behaviors that they are excited to see. And so positioning our CBOs to be some of those spotlights is something that we have been working really hard with our state affiliates to build out those kind of profiles. And so I think it's really important for there to be that strong bridge between what's happening in the communities on the ground to the state houses and to the federal lawmaking areas as well.
Thanks, CJ. And so as we wind down here, I'm gonna turn with one final question, unless I've got others coming from our attendees, so feel free to continue to populate the Q&A box if you've got additional questions as our time winds down. I'd love to sort of just reflect as we begin to think about closing out with a question, and I'll start with you, CJ, on this, and then go to you, Secretary Bridges. What's the one kernel of wisdom or one nugget of perspective that is particularly important that you want to share with our audience that maybe we've not yet touched on in this conversation today? What's the one thing you would leave our audience with on this set of issues?
I don't want to bastardize the quote too much, but the moral arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice, right? I think that it's really important to note that what happened this summer did not happen overnight. It was the result of a very persistent set of advocates really going back to the Supreme Court over and over again, going back to the judicial system over and over again until they found something that stuck. But also they used the tools of the civil rights movement to get to this point. And I think it's perfectly well within our capabilities to take those tools back and to make sure that we don't allow those tools to be usurped and used for ill, but to make sure that we are using every tool at our disposal via communication streams, via federal advocacy, state advocacy, local work, and demonstrations to show people what's really important, what we really want to see in our future country. And so don't be deterred. I think we've all had a moment of mourning with this decision. That was the summer. It's now cold, and we have to keep the pedal to the metal because it's going to be more important than ever that we stand up on behalf of our students and stand up on behalf of our communities to ensure that everyone knows that they have a place in our institutions of higher education.
CJ, you're reminding me what I know you and I have both heard from our admissions community. This is a marathon, not a sprint.
That's
and
right.
So as much and as frenetic as the work is in this moment in time, we've got to give ourselves permission to have that mid and long-term focus, not just the short-term focus. So I really appreciate that perspective a lot. Secretary Bridges, I'm going to give you the last opportunity here to round us out with some sort of kernel or nugget of wisdom or perspective that you'd want this audience to hear as we think about this work moving forward.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Art, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for bringing us all together and facilitating this dialogue. I think CJ, you reminded me. I'm a child of history. I love history, and it's something that people should be reminded of. That I know that we people despaired after the summer, but he's absolutely right that going back to Charles Hamilton, Houston, and Thurgood Marshall, and the 2 to 3 decades of effort to dismantle segregation in schools and other strategies to attack racist policies in American life. The same thing was done with this. So this has been a multi-decade fight by the side who are against these kinds of policies and practices that create a more equitable and diverse society. And so we have to try to work to swing the pendulum back the other way. And so the idea of this being a marathon is right, but that we have to be persistent in the same way that those forefathers like Houston and Marshall created a long-term strategy to fight against this. And I think now this is just simply going to result in a constant battle in the courts to continue to create the kind of America that we want to see in our colleges, in our classrooms, in our society. And, I think that there are lots of advocates who believe in this. And I think the elections on Tuesday night helped to reinforce some of that there are lots of people, millions and millions of people out there who are interested in these kinds of policies, practices, and outcomes prevailing. And so we have to just remain diligent more than anything else to pursue the kind of America that not only we want, but that I think a lot of people don't realize that they want and need. And so I would say that people like you, Art, and others continue the good work that you're doing. The Hunt Institute needs to continue having these kinds of forums and making efforts to make sure that this message is carried not just to the choir. I imagine that the people on this line are on this webinar are the choir, but to make sure that the message is consistent so that we can convert other people to the choir as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. And I will just round out both of your point and CJ's point by saying, I think in this sort of legal context, it's important that we not become our own worst enemy. This court decision, as bad and flawed as it was, I think elevated not only what you can't do in certain contexts, but what you can do. And there's so much this court opinion did not touch at all that still gives us a platform for effective strategic change around these diversity, equity, and inclusion goals that are at the center of so much of higher education's work. And so I would encourage us all to remain focused there. And
Art, I would applaud, I know you and I have talked about that before, and I hope that, and I know that that's part of your effort for helping people to realize that this does not signal the death knell that people think it did. Right. And so I think that people have to be, you hear the outcome isn't what we anticipated. And so I think people rush to the extreme and have continued to do so. And so I think that message that you just reinforced is so important for our college leaders and for people in our general society as well to understand that, we have to understand, yes, what the decision says we can't do, but we also have to pay attention to what it doesn't tell us that we can do. So, I always tell people, as a former research person, that there's as much to learn in the negative outcome as there is in the positive outcome as well, and vice versa. So definitely keep pushing that message.
Thank you. And I think playing up of one of CJ's earlier points, I sense as well a renewed energy in the field around the set of issues moving forward. So let me just say thanks to the both of you. This has been a great conversation. And I appreciate all of our attendees joining us today. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Hunt Institute will share this recording and key takeaways in the coming weeks, and then continue to share opportunities to connect and learn together. I also want to spotlight that the Hunt Institute's upcoming webinar on December 12th at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time will be entitled Post-Secondary Pathways, Leveraging the Power of State and Federal HBCU Caucuses to Combat HBCU Underfunding, another sort of foundation for leverage and change moving forward. Thank you all for joining us, and take care.